Throughout the summer, we watch bears gorge themselves on salmon to prepare for the long impending winter months. Brown bears must be a healthy, fat weight in order to survive another hibernation cycle. Though we humans celebrate the bears of Brooks River for accomplishing the goal of massive weight gain, the true test for these giants is if they can survive another winter. Here to help us understand the biology and what hibernation is Dr. Michael Saxton. Michael, how are you doing today?
Hey everybody, yeah, doing well. Good to see you virtually here, Sarah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're sort of in the close up out here at Brooks Camp, and everything's kind of bears are starting to think about getting ready to head up the hill, and we're enjoying the fall colors out here.
Yeah, heading up the hill. I know we've seen it seems like every spring that we head out to Brooks Camp, Michael, you do go up Dumpling to look for any dens that might have happened. Did you see any this spring or?
So I don't do that as much now that I've got a
Mm,
little one. A 2-year-old makes it a little bit tougher for me to do my annual trek up the mountain. But we did get up there this year at one point, a little bit later in the year. I didn't notice any. I got a report of one potentially, but not one that anybody was able to get to. A few people tried.
mhm.
It was on the other side of a pretty good gully. You could see it really well while you're going up the mountain, but once you got across onto the same hillside as it, nobody was able to find it. But yeah, I did not find any this spring.
Yeah, we usually see at least or hear about at least one bear hibernating up on Dumpling, and that's kind of easy pickings for them since it's just right there. But the bears kind of go wherever in the park, even outside the boundaries, to find their den and hibernate there. We'll talk about what it is like to choose a spot for the den. But Michael, let's kind of talk about what the Bears are doing right now. They kind of go through this cycle each year where almost the entire year is the same for them. They wake up, they feast on salmon, they prepare for winter, they hibernate, and then they wake up and do it all again. But let's talk about what they're doing right now. So they're preparing for hibernation and they're in a state that we call hyperphagia. Can you kind of explain what that is and how it affects the bear's preparation for hibernation?
Sure. Yeah, so hyperphagia isn't it's not unique to bears. It's actually, used as a medical definition as well. It's basically just a term for an organism that is just eating and eating and eating and just won't stop eating. It's just going to continue to gorge itself and won't feel full at any point in time. So with bears, what we see is as we start getting in towards fall, we see a reduction in what are known as satiety factors. So it's hormones that are circulating through our system. They're released by different organs in our body. And the bears basically stop responding to these satiety factors. They're still producing them. There's ghrelin that's produced by the stomach when it's full. Insulin is actually a satiety factor. But bears, so what that does, that gets to your brain and then it releases something called neuropeptide Y. And they just stop responding to that. Even though the ghrelin or insulin may still be present at normal volumes in their system, circulating, their brain doesn't respond to it in the same way, and so they just don't feel full. Essentially, is what we believe is occurring. So they will just eat and just keep eating and keep eating and keep eating as much as they possibly can, trying to put on as much fat as possible to prepare for hibernation. Of course, they need lots of fat in order to make it through 6 months or so of not eating. They also need lots of fat in order to produce cubs, in order to be able to sustain cubs through the winter. Fat is very important for bears, as I'm sure most of our viewers are aware. But so they're trying to put on as much as they possibly can in order to make it through winter.
Yeah, in July we see them, kind of doing that thing that we call high grading, where they're eating the skin, the head, and the eggs of the salmon. But and so we see them eating salmon throughout the year, and in fall we see them eating dead and dying salmon. So after these salmon have spawned out and are starting to wash down river, do we see? Have you noticed the bears eating anything besides these dead and dying salmon if they're just being told by their bodies to eat and eat and eat?
Sure. Noticing them eating, not so much. Noticing the evidence of them eating lots of other things, absolutely. In their scat, we're seeing lots of berries this time of year. The watermelon berries are pretty much done at this point, but we're still seeing a lot of high bush cranberry and blueberry in particular in their scat. Also getting some of the low bush cranberries showing up. A couple other little things. See them eating grass. That shows up in the scat as well quite a bit at this time. So a little bit of everything, kind of hitting all their favorites throughout the year as best they can, whatever's left at this point.
Yeah, whatever smells good, whatever tastes good, just
Uh-huh.
to get it in the
Which is
belly.
which is probably just about everything right now.
Fair enough. um, so you talked about some of the like biological cues that are telling them to keep eating and everything. And we don't necessarily know what that feels like for a bear, but can you kind of go into more depth about these hormones and like if we could take a guess of what it feels like to be in hyperphagia, what other cues are these bears getting that it is time to go into hibernation?
Hmm. Okay, so what triggers are we seeing that
Yeah.
causes them to move towards hibernation?
Mhm.
That's a really, really great question, and we really don't know the answer. There has been a lot of research over the past 5 or 6 decades trying to figure out something. For a long time, they were looking for something that they called the HIT, the hibernation induction trigger, and that was a fairly fruitless search. They looked for a long time trying to find the one thing that if you did this, that would cause a bear or some other animals to go into hibernation. And at least with bears, they never really found that. They tried temperature, and that did not do it. Light conditions in combination with temperature did not do it. Best guess right now would be that they do have some sort of a circannual rhythm that's occurring. So their body is just, same way that we have circadian rhythms, our bodies have circannual rhythms as well. They know that at this time of year, it's time for us to do different things. And particularly for a bear that has a very strong annual cycle, they likely have a stronger circannual rhythm. That circadian rhythm, same as with our circadian rhythm, it requires various outside influences in order to try and keep it on track and kind of tell it approximately where you are. So for the circadian rhythm in us, it's daylight. So when we've got a bunch of daylight, that's what helps us reset our circadian rhythm. If we don't have any access to light, our circadian rhythm will actually start to float a little bit and it gets a little bit off of the normal. It's not exactly a 24-hour cycle, essentially. So probably similar with the circannual rhythm with bears. The temperature, light, things like that are probably helping to entrain that circannual rhythm so that their body knows when to do what. It does seem like snowfall is a pretty good trigger for them to start moving up the hill. For a lot of them, that's around the first snowfall is when we'll start seeing it, seeing bears moving up towards denning. Um, there is a really excellent paper that I would have to review. I believe it was by Alina Evans, working in the Scandinavian brown bear population that looked at sort of what was going on inside their bodies, looking at heart rate and stuff like that, and with various ambient temperature conditions and ambient conditions in general. And I would need to review that to remember exactly what happened first and what order everything occurred in. But it did seem like there was ambient temperature drop sort of in concert with this beginning of reduction in metabolic rate and reduction in heart rate and other such things.
Yeah. So we know that they're not going to go into some sort of hyperphagic state in the middle of July. That's just typically not going to happen for them. It's going to be later in the summer, earlier in the fall, that time frame. Unless I don't know, you look skeptical of that.
I wouldn't say skeptical. I'm intrigued, is what I would say. I don't know of anything that has looked into, aberrant cycles where bears have gone into, or where any animal has gotten off of their normal circannual cycle like that. But I don't believe that it's impossible. I would actually suspect that it probably does happen occasionally. Just as we get unusual physiological changes happening in people, I imagine you probably might get the same thing with bears. Um, Depending on how that happened, I suppose, if you were completely off and went into hibernation in July, then you probably would not survive through the winter. So
Yeah.
there's a reasonably strong selective factor to make sure that uh, anything like that would not occur if it's genetically entrained in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah. They probably would not survive because then they would be waking up out of hibernations probably like in the middle of winter, and that would not be
Yeah.
ideal. There would be no food.
either you'd be waking up in the middle of winter or you'd be trying to sleep for 10 months straight with only the grasses that were available in June to fatten you up for it. So it'd be pretty tough to do that probably.
Yeah. Do you think that the latitude that a brown bear is at may also send them into a hyperphagic state or a hibernative state earlier or later? I know. So the population of brown bears kind of circumnavigates the top half of the globe. So we see them in Russia, we see them in North America, and in Northern Europe as well. But that latitude kind of spans quite a few different degrees. At Katmai, we're about 58 degrees north, but we see them lower than the 45th parallel below Canada. Do you think that the latitude these bears are at could affect what time of year or earlier in the fall versus later in the fall that they're going into hibernation, just due to food availability throughout the year?
Yeah, so that's another really interesting question. I don't know is the answer. I would believe that whether or not latitude affects it, certainly ambient conditions probably would, and winter conditions would affect that. The reason I'm not 100% willing to tie it to latitude right now is that someplace like Yellowstone actually a lot of times will have, like they may have a longer winter than some places that are further north, just due to the
Sure.
local geography and geology there, being in that caldera. Uh, my understanding is it tends to make the winters pretty epic. I haven't spent a lot of time in Yellowstone, but that is my understanding of that region. So I don't know if it would be directly tied to latitude, but something like that where ambient conditions are affecting it. I strongly suspect that would be the case. We certainly know that bears that are in warmer climates with shorter winters tend to have shorter hibernation periods. I mean, you talked about where they exist currently. Of course, a long time ago, centuries ago, they were down throughout North America and even into northern Canada or northern Mexico as well. There were brown bears in Africa at one point in time. So they were in many warmer climates as well at various points in history. And I do suspect that those bears probably had much shorter hibernation periods. We see that with black bears, certainly. Black bears in the southeast United States tend to have shorter hibernation periods than those in colder climates do. And in fact, you see some bears that are not denning at all during throughout the winter months, just depending on what the year goes like. So yeah, I would believe latitude would certainly play into that idea of what the ambient conditions are like is going to affect length of hibernation and the timing of when all of that occurs.
Yeah. It's so interesting to just think about what these bears go through in just a short period of time and everything. And so as these bears are preparing for hibernation, going through hyperphagia, once they are ready to go up the hill, as you say, how do they choose a spot for their dens? Do we know anything about their how they choose to build a den, where they build their dens, and kind of the structure of what a den is? Because they don't use them year after year. They build a new one each year.
Correct. Yeah. So brown bears are different than, I was just talking about black bears. Black bears den fairly differently than brown bears do oftentimes. Brown bears do dig their own dens. That's the standard at least, is for them to dig a new den every year. How exactly what they're looking for varies from location to location. There have been denning studies in a lot of different sites that have found different, like, oh, here they like a north-facing slope, and here they like an east-facing slope. Once again, I would hazard a guess that has to do with ambient conditions, but I don't know that. In Katmai, the only denning study that has looked at those sorts of things before was done in the 1970s, and found that they tended to prefer north-facing slopes, though any slope would do, above 500 meters in general, and steeper is often better. Of course, you don't want to be vertical, but a good steep hillside that they could dig into really well and create a nice little den. They're going to be aware, I'm sure, in some way of trying to find substrates that are less likely to have den collapse. We believe that's why they typically are going up above 500 meters, is that at that elevation, it stays cold enough that you're not getting a bunch of freeze-thaw cycles through the winter, which freeze-thaw cycles would contribute to den collapse as well. So we suspect that is the reasoning or the rationale, whether intentional or not, or whether conscious or not, I should say, behind the selection at that elevation. Um, yeah, but it's been a long time since we've really looked intensely at it. Back then, they did find a lot of dens on Dumpling and a few over by, quite a few over in the mountains over by Savanoski River. But yeah, really all of these mountains do get some. And the reason why I talk in a lot of generalities with this is we also get bears in town that will den at 50 feet of elevation in a tiny little hillside.
Yep.
So we get unusual denning locations all the time, but generally speaking, above 500 meters, a decent slope to it is going to be what they're looking for.
Yeah, you mentioned the north side, the north slope of a hillside there too, and I just want to point out that in the northern hemisphere, the north side is getting the least amount of sun, so that's also contributing to the lessening of the freeze thaw cycle that we go through in the springtime. So
Sure.
yeah, so these bears are not using caves as we often think of bears hibernating in caves. They're digging their own dens and finding their perfect hillside to go into.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are occasions where brown bears use caves, and I hope that there's some biologists out there that will email me and tell me how wrong I am about anything in this talk. But generally speaking, I mean, brown bears are very well adapted for digging. Black bears, you're more likely to find using things like caves, natural structures, whether that's root balls, caves, or man-made things like culverts and underhouses and stuff like that, where they're less likely to dig something and more likely to just use something that is available.
Yeah. Yeah. Brown bears have those like longer claws than black bears. And black bears, they're more adapted to climbing than brown bears, which I don't know that that has anything to do with hibernation. But yeah, when you look at those adaptations, you can tell. I think polar bears have really good digging claws too, don't they?
So they do have shorter, more
Journey.
curved claws, kind of like a black bear does. I am a lot less familiar with polar bears, so I don't want to go out too far on this one. But yeah, they do have shorter, curved claws. Breaking through ice, I don't think they're doing a lot of digging in
Yeah.
the soil, but I'm not sure about that. Once again, if there's a biologist out there that can answer that question for me, I would love to hear about it.
Yeah. All right. Kind of getting into the weeds there, asking about polar bears and black bears and all these things. We're talking about our Katmai brown bears, which we are more adept into knowing about. So the bears have chose it. They've eaten all they can. They've gone up the hillside. They've chosen their den site. And then they go into hibernation. And we were kind of talking about this before the chat, where before I even started working for Katmai, I always assumed hibernation is just a deep sleep that the bears go into. But you very quickly corrected me in saying that it is not sleep.
Mhm.
Can you tell us what exactly hibernation is?
Yeah, absolutely. So hibernation is simply a reduction in the metabolic rate that coincides with cold ambient temperatures and low food availability. So it's a version of what's called torpor, which is just that reduction of metabolic rate. Um, so this is something that I tend to get a bit in the weeds on. So please stop me if I'm going down a rabbit hole. But people will often talk about bears that are not denning and say that they're bears that are not hibernating. And those are two distinct things. A bear can have a reduction in metabolic rate without denning. So even where we have situations where bears are known to be active throughout the winter, it's possible they still have a reduced metabolic rate, which could be considered a form of hibernation, even if they're still active. You talked about sleep and whether or not hibernation is sleep. Um, Bears still have that circadian rhythm even while they're in hibernation. So they'll still have periods of sleep essentially during hibernation. Um, so bears hibernate very differently than a lot of other mammals do. For a long time there was this big debate about whether or not bears are true hibernators. Um, and there's been arguments on either side of that for a long time because they hibernate very differently. The hibernation was originally defined in small mammals where they're dropping their body temperature down to, near ambient, it's close to 0 degrees Celsius. Their heart rate and respiration are, almost nil. It's a much deeper torpor. But then every 2 weeks or so, they would actually arouse from torpor. They would kind of become active. Different species do different things. Some would go get food during that time, some wouldn't. Bears don't do that. Bears, once they drop into hibernation, for the most part, they stay in that reduced metabolic rate throughout the course of the winter. Uh, and they retain, as I mentioned, they retain that circadian rhythm. Those small mammals, when they are waking up periodically, one of the theories about what they might be waking up for is actually that they're waking up in order to sleep, that they need to give their brain that rest period of sleep, and they need to have their body more active in order to do so. Bears, because they maintain a higher metabolic rate, they're able to continue sort of a version of sleep-wake cycles even throughout the course of hibernation.
Yeah, you mentioned torpor quite a bit, and that hibernation is a type of torpor. Can you kind of go into, so if hibernation is a type of torpor where it's that reduced metabolic rate, but with a higher rate than other animals that are in torpor, um, what what kind of differentiates torpor from hibernation?
This is a square versus rectangle kind of a
Yep.
situation. Hibernation is torpor, but torpor is not necessarily hibernation.
Yep.
I'm going to once again talk about another species in order to illustrate this one. Bats. I'm a big fan of bats. Bats also hibernate in the winter, but in addition to a winter hibernation, they also have a daily torpor. So they will, during the day, in order to save their energy resources because they're very small, they don't have huge fat reserves on hand. In order to save their energy, they will actually drop into torpor on a daily basis. Hummingbirds do the same thing. In order to save energy during the time that they are not foraging, they will drop into a torpor. There's also another form of torpor called estivation, which is like hibernation, but they sleep or they go into torpor during the summer rather than during the winter. And you find that in very hot climates. There are some ground squirrels that will do that. So they go into torpor during the summer and then become active during the winter. So torpor is just that reduction in metabolic rate. Hibernation is that during the cold period with low food availability during the cold period.
Yeah. You mentioned bats. One of the animals within Katmai National Park that I think of as going into torpor is the wood frog. Not a mammal. Neither of us are herpetologists,
Mhm.
but the wood frog does go into a state of torpor as well in the wintertime. This is totally not about bears, but I just think it's cool that the wood frog's the only amphibian that can live above the Arctic Circle, and it's because they can go into a state of torpor. So, but
Yep.
just a little aside, I love it. You love bats and bears. I love bears and wood frogs. Just those cool little adaptations that these animals
Yeah.
have in the park.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so the bears go into hibernation and they're in this reduced metabolic state. They're not eating, they're relying on their fat reserves and things like that. But not all bears are the same when they go into this state. There could be more, but I think of at least three different categories of bears that are going into hibernation. So you have these male bears who are not giving birth. They don't have cubs to rely on. They're kind of taking care of themselves, right? And then you have these females who have to get into a certain have to have enough fat reserves in order to support a pregnancy and give birth in the den. And then you have these females who are not giving birth but still have cubs with them. And we've seen in the park, you know, these sows are coming back year after year with these cubs. Usually, we only see them spend about 2 years in 2 or 3 years in the den with a sow, but we're seeing more and more bears holding on to their cubs for longer. So let's start with the males who are going into hibernation. It's kind of like that classic hibernation story that we were just talking about. But is there anything specific to the males that they have to worry about when they're in the den in hibernation?
Interesting question. I am not aware of anything. I mean, for me, I think of it as basically, so I see the distinction that you're making. You got the sows with cubs still with them. Pregnancy is the one that I definitely primarily am thinking of as being different. Yeah, males, as you mentioned, that's kind of just your standard, they don't need to worry about anyone but themselves. They're just going to go in. It doesn't that doesn't hurt them with the getting bigger and bigger because generally speaking, so a male or a bear that's not pregnant might lose 15 to 33% of their body fat. 15 would be pretty low, but maybe 20 to 33% of their body fat throughout the course of hibernation. Whereas, should I start talking about females that are
Yeah, go
pregnant?
for it.
Yeah, okay. So females that are pregnant, they use a lot. They need a lot more energy, essentially. This is why if they're below about 25% body fat, um, pregnancy is not going to take. They're just gonna auto abort essentially, and then they're not going to have cubs because they don't have the resources to be able to sustain them. As you get over that 25% body fat mark, then the higher percentage of body fat they have, the more cubs that they're able to sustain, and more likely that they're going to have more cubs, essentially. Um, what we do see is that females that give birth tend to lose about, I said that it was in the 20 to 33% body fat lost or of body weight lost during hibernation for those males. It's closer to 40% for females that are giving birth. So 40% of their body mass is lost over the course of a single winter. And we talk about, so bears give birth during hibernation. Um, and this actually gets back to, I think this was in that same Alina Evans paper out of the Scandinavian population. I think it was the same paper. So what they were doing is they were implanting heart rate monitors into some bears, and then they would stay in there through the winter, and those monitors would track things like heart rate variability, but also body temperature, as well as they'd have some measures of ambient temperature. And what they were finding is that in the weeks leading up to giving birth, the metabolic rates of these females were increasing, not all the way back up to active state, but pretty close to active state. So their torpor essentially, it was a milder version of torpor as they got closer and closer to pregnant or to giving birth. Um, and then as soon as they did give birth, they would drop right back down to that sort of baseline state of hibernation. And then during that time, the cubs they then crawl up and start suckling, and they just nurse themselves essentially until it's time to exit the den. Um, and yeah, nursing babies takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of calories in order to be able to sustain not only yourself, but multiple other living things as well. So they tend to need a lot higher percent body fat. The sows with cubs that are going back into the den with them is a really fascinating question that I don't know the answer to, um, as far as whether or not those cubs are nursing at all during the course of hibernation. I don't know the answer to that. It's something that has interested me for a while. I would love to know if they are continuing to nurse during hibernation, because if they are continuing to nurse during hibernation, then yeah, once again, she's going to need a much greater percent body fat as she's going into the den. Um, Especially with older cubs, the amount of milk that she would need to produce would be pretty impressive. I have a tough time believing that they are nursing regularly during hibernation as a result of that. Usually the sows with cubs, when we see them going back towards the dens, they don't seem to be they have not put on as much body weight as the solo bears have. Um, and I suspect they would struggle to sustain that level of milk production if they were nursing regularly throughout the course of the winter. But it's possible that the cubs do nurse sporadically here and there. That would probably help to retain milk production for the following year if they were doing that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, can you remind us, do we see yearling cubs or older cubs nursing throughout the summer season? Can you remind us whether or not that does happen?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we do see that. Cubs will continue to nurse as long as they're with mom, essentially. Of course, as they get older, they will have other sources of nutrition as well. They're going to start getting fish, berries, other things like that. But as long as they're with mom, they will generally continue to nurse. So I've seen 3.5-year-old cubs that are almost the same size as the sow, still nursing.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a very specific bear that is too old to be a cub still. And it's like, you're still nursing on that girl. Come on. Uh, so when these sows with cubs go back into the den, you talked about whether or not they're nursing, but are these cubs also going into a state of torpor? Are they also kind of hibernating as well? Or is their metabolic rate higher than the sow?
I can't answer definitively with data, but I would struggle to see how they would survive the winter if they were not going into some form of hibernation. How that metabolic rate and how the reduction in metabolic rate compares to an adult, I don't know. That would be a really interesting thing to look into with those heart rate monitors to see whether or not you see any difference based off of the age class in metabolic rate. Trying to remember if anyone has done that. If so, I have not looked at it recently. But yeah, that'd be interesting to look into.
Yeah. So when these bears enter into their dens, let's kind of talk about the timeline of when all this happened. So they're in hyperphagia right now. When will we see them going into their dens to start hibernating?
It varies, and it varies a little bit with age and sex class, but usually I would say around the beginning of November, we'll start seeing them. The number of bears that are down here in the Brooks River seems like it's decreasing at that point. So between late October, beginning of December is when I would expect them to start to be going into denning and hibernation. Um, of course, there's always the random bear that we hear about wandering around in January or something that bears will, if they get a warm day, then they will come up out of their dens. Metabolic rate will increase. They'll look around, see if there's any food available or anything like that. Um, so you never know. There might be one that stays out later. There's also on Kodiak, there are big males that I've heard reports at least that there are some big males that are not denning there, just depending on food availability. Now, I'm going to reiterate again, they're not denning. I don't know whether or not they are hibernating at that point.
Sure.
If they're active, my strong assumption would be that their metabolic rate is higher than if they were denning, but perhaps still reduced from the standard active season rate.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Um, so if a female they go into the dens and would you say like a female who is maybe going to prepare to give birth, do you think that they're going into the dens earlier in that late October to early December, or they earlier or later in that kind of time frame?
Oh boy, this is one I should know. I always switch this up, so I'm fairly confident though. So usually what you get is sows with cubs going in first,
Mhm.
then solo females, then adult males generally going in last. Adult males, if I'm not switching it up, usually it's adult males in last and out first.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
somebody should double check me on that though.
So if the
Uh,
if the females who or the solo females who could potentially be giving birth in the dens, when does that birth typically take place?
Birth is going to be anytime from late December to early February. January is a very good guess. So generally, if you say January, you're probably correct.
And so, if the males are going in last and out first, and then would we see that pattern happen on the other side of winter where the males are out first, and then the solo females, and then the females with cubs?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's generally speaking, I think the case. And of course, this is broad generalities. There is all sorts of variation within that, but in general, I believe that's the case.
Yeah. So what is that timeline in the spring for these males to start emerging and then these females?
Another really good question. I mentioned that we have not done any work on the Katmai bears denning since the 1970s. Um, we have not had any sort of tracking devices on bears emerging from dens.
Mhm.
Since then, if they even had them then, and back then they were not GPS trackers, they were VHFs, so you only knew that they were active because you went out flying around and saw them, and they did not do any of that work in the spring. So we really don't have any data on when they're emerging from the dens. Um, when we start seeing them around town, I mean, this year, the day I think that our maintenance crew showed up out in Brooks Camp to start opening up, they saw some bears that were around here. That's probably what, mid-April, I think.
Yeah, I was gonna say right around April
Um,
15th is when they start to maintenance
yeah,
Brooks.
yeah. So there's some activity then. That would kind of be my estimate, would be beginning of April-ish. They'd start moving, maybe late March, early April, but it's going to depend on the year and the ambient temperature, ambient conditions, as I mentioned. If it's warmer, then they'll get up and start looking around. If it stays really cold for a long time, they're probably going to stay in a little bit later. But I'd say, yeah, early April is probably a reasonable estimate for when they're starting to come out.
Yeah, so between early April and when the salmon start to run, really in mid-June to late July, um, they're eating. What are they eating? Grasses, leftover kill sites, things like that. There's not much for them.
Whatever they can. Yeah, their grasses are certainly a much heavier part of the diet at that time of year. I've seen them eating crowberries left over from the previous year up on dumpling. I have occasionally seen them digging up and eating old salmon heads on the beach. I mean, it's basically just bone and skin at that point. But I've seen them dig those up and eat them. There's a lot of other plant species that are starting to come out that the bears will get into. The horsetail around here is pretty popular once that starts to show up. Um, yeah, a few of the others, the twisted stalk, I've seen them eat those leaves pretty heavily when those start coming in. But yeah, it's really anything they can get. If you're out on the coast of the park, then sedges are a little more available, clams, mussels, limpets, other things like that, some of those shellfish. And then if they're really lucky, a whale carcass will wash up or something like that. But yeah, here in Brooks on this side of the range, it's a little bit sparser and just whatever's around, they'll try and find. But that time of year, they're also often um, they're not, it's not until the salmon get in that they're really starting to pack the pounds back on, starting to rebuild all of the fat reserves and stuff that they've lost over the winter.
Yeah. And so they're just going back into this cycle again. They kind of have this same year over and over where they wake up in the spring, they're eating grasses, they wait for the salmon to come back, and they're feasting on salmon through June, July, and August. And then September, they really start to hit that hyperphagic stage, preparing for hibernation. We see them going into hibernation in late October into December, hibernating up until maybe March or April. So they're not in the dens for really too long. They are out of their dens for a good chunk of the year, it seems like. And then they wake up and we see them do it all over again.
Yep. Yeah, they're pretty incredible. They keep that up. I mentioned Yellowstone earlier. I believe they might actually have a longer hibernation period in Yellowstone because they do have longer, colder winters over in that portion of the world than we do here. Because we're so coastal, we've got a lot much more moderated climate. So while it gets reasonably cold, it's not quite as long usually as some other areas. So some of those places you hear of 6, even 7 month hibernation periods, but our bears here are fortunate. They don't have to deal with quite that long normally.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about hibernation or brown bear related at all, that our audience should know about these bears before they start to go into their dens for the season?
Oh boy. Open-ended. You've hit my favorites. The ones that I really get on a soapbox about. You've kind of nailed those. I can mention that a bear just walked by in front of the cabin that I'm sitting in.
Amazing.
So that's always fun. Um, I think you've pretty much hit the highlights. Yeah, I guess just so yeah, berries becoming available in August through September. It's a lot of good food resources here in Katmai, so we're pretty fortunate. There are bears in a lot of other areas that are not as fortunate as our bears here, for several reasons. So yeah.
Yeah. We've had a pretty long standing working and personal relationship. So I feel like when I was preparing for to talk with you today, I was like, oh, you know what? I know what Michael likes to talk about. I know what he gets on his soapbox about. So I'll make sure I include all of that.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
yeah, anytime. One thing that we have been asking our guests on the live chats, what can the folks at home do to help in brown bear or bear conservation as a whole as they start to get threatened by climate change and other outside factors? What can the folks do at home in order to help those conservation efforts?
That's a really great question. Boy, that is a tricky one and very, very broad. I would start by pointing out that, as I mentioned, our brown bears here in Katmai are very fortunate. We've got incredible food resources available here. There are 8 species of bears on the planet, and 6 of those species are either threatened or endangered. Brown bears are not one of those species. So there's a lot of work that is going on, a lot of work that needs to be done trying to help out some of those other species, and they're threatened to a variety of factors. Um, Climate change is kind of an unknown moving into the future here. Yeah, I mean, brown bears throughout the United States, there's a lot going on there down in the Greater Yellowstone and North Cascades or Northern Continental Divide ecosystems. There is concern about what climate change might do to the white bark pine, which is an important source of food for the bears there. So just looking into that more. I know they're planning on starting the reintroduction of bears into the North Cascades ecosystem. So just staying involved, looking out for management plans and stuff that affect that, and looking out for opportunities to comment on those, and trying to make sure that we promote the conservation of these animals where we can. And then in Katmai, I mean, we've got, there's always various management plans and stuff going on here. And just making your voices heard, and please comment. We got the wilderness and backcountry management plan coming out for public comment here in late October, I believe, through early December. And just making your voices heard, and making sure that we're looking out for these incredible animals, both here and elsewhere.
Awesome. All right, my last and final question for you. I think the audience wants to know, we do have Fat Bear Week coming up. Fat Bear Junior is this week. Are you rooting for any specific bear in our tournaments this in the next coming weeks?
Are you sure you want to ask me that question?
I do. I'm very positive.
um, um, I do not have a bear that I am rooting for in Fat Bear Week. Yeah, I do not. I have bears that I enjoy working with, but I am a big fan of viewing all of these animals as just incredible wild brown bears, and tend to stay out of some of the day-to-day drama of individual bears. Um, yeah.
Fair enough. I think you and I are both rooting for their healthy survival throughout the winter.
Yes, very much so.
All right. Thank you, Michael, so much for joining us today. That was Dr. Michael Saxton, our bear management expert out at Brooks Camp. My name is Sarah Bruce with the National Park Service. Thank you so much for joining us today.